You are not here by accident. The simple fact that these words have found you now, in this particular moment, is its own quiet anomaly. Life has a way of delivering certain messages only when a person's inner landscape has been prepared to receive them. This is one of those messages. And what it points to is something most seekers spend years, even decades, unknowingly circling around. The final test. For much of your life, perhaps without realizing it, you've been navigating a labyrinth of teachings, methods, and philosophies. You chased after the perfect spiritual practice, the ideal meditation technique, the most precise manifestation formula. You attended the workshops, read the books, took the courses. Each one promised that with the right alignment, the right thoughts, the right vibrational frequency, the door would finally open. And for fleeting moments, it did. There were days when you felt the pulse of something extraordinary, an inner stillness, a surge of connection, a sense that all the pieces were falling into place. But just as quickly as they appeared, those moments slipped away, leaving you with the same old patterns, the same stubborn limitations reflected back to you. So you tried harder. You swapped methods, redoubled your efforts, questioned your worthiness. You blamed yourself for not doing it right or for lacking enough faith, enough purity, enough discipline. All the while, without knowing it, you were being examined. Not in the way you might imagine. No divine clipboard ticking off your failures or successes, but through the simple unfolding of life itself. The test was never about whether you could manipulate your reality well enough. The test was whether you could come to see that there was never a test at all. It sounds almost insulting at first, doesn't it? After years of striving, to be told that the real breakthrough is to stop striving. Yet this is the paradox at the heart of spiritual awakening. The so-called final test is past the moment you no longer feel the need to pass anything. If you look back over the last year, or perhaps the last several months, you may notice a subtle change. You've been catching glimpses of peace without chasing it. Synchronicities have been appearing without you scripting them into existence. Flashes of clarity arrive unannounced, without you dissecting them or turning them into another method. You've stopped grasping at the next big secret, maybe not entirely, but enough that you've begun to taste the relief of simply being. This is not a new idea. History is filled with mystics, sages, and quiet revolutionaries who stumbled upon the same recognition. From the Zen masters of medieval Japan, who liken enlightenment to simply chopping wood and carrying water, to the Sufi poets of Persia, who sang that God was closer than your own breath, the message has always been the same. What you seek is not somewhere else, and it never has been. But like every generation before you, you had to wander through the mirage before you could see the desert for what it was. And here you are now, standing in that desert, realizing it is not barren at all. It is spacious, boundless. The horizon stretches in every direction, and for the first time, you're not frantic to find the exit. You understand, perhaps dimly but unmistakably, that the searching itself was the doorway, and that by stepping out of the endless exam room of self-measurement, you've walked into the very freedom you thought you had to earn. The real shift begins here, not in perfecting a technique, but in loosening your grip on the idea that there is something left to perfect. The moment you stop treating consciousness as a destination, a skill to master, or a trophy to win, something extraordinary begins to unfold. You start to see it not as something you reach, but as the very ground you have always been standing on. This is the quiet but seismic recognition. Consciousness is not what you attain, it's what you are. It's a shift that feels subtle at first, like turning your head ever so slightly, and catching the world from a new angle. And yet the implications are radical. For years, you might have believed that the path to awakening was about becoming more aware, more spiritual, more aligned. But once the seeking loosens its grip, you realize that the awareness you were chasing is the same awareness that has been quietly watching every step of your journey. Quantum physics has a curious way of mirroring this truth. In the quantum field, the observer and the observed are not separate. They are part of the same system. The act of observing doesn't just measure reality, it participates in creating it. This is not merely poetic metaphor. Experiments in quantum mechanics show that particles do not settle into a fixed state until they are observed. In a very real sense, the you who is aware is not standing outside life, watching it happen. You are life. The field of possibility localized here, in this precise point of awareness, looking out through your eyes. Once you see this, the endless self-improvement project begins to lose its urgency. You no longer feel compelled to fix yourself because you grasp deeply in your bones that there was never anything wrong to begin with. You stop measuring your worth by how well you can raise your vibration or by how pure your intentions seem to be. You start creating not to fill a gap, but to explore the sheer joy of expression. History, again, offers its echoes. The Upanishads, ancient Indian texts written over 2,500 years ago, spoke of Tattvam Asi, thou art that. They weren't instructing their students to become the absolute. They were reminding them that they already were the absolute, disguised in human form. The early Taoist sages in China taught something similar. The Tao that can be sought is not the eternal Tao. In other words, the moment you try to get there, you step away from what has always been here. When you operate from the recognition that you are consciousness itself, a remarkable thing happens to the space between where you are and where you want to be. That gap, which once drove your every action, filled with longing and tension, simply collapses. There is no gap, and without a gap, there is no resistance. Without resistance, life begins to move through you with an ease you might have once dismissed as impossible. From here, manifestation shifts from a desperate attempt to change your life into an effortless unfolding. You no longer chase experiences to prove your worth. You allow experiences to flow as a natural reflection of the wholeness you already embody. You create the way an artist paints, not because the canvas is empty and must be filled, but because the colors demand to move, to merge, to take form. This is the turning point where the old paradigm falls away, where you stop treating consciousness as a tool in your spiritual toolbox and start recognizing it as the very fabric of your being. The seeking was the prologue. This is where the story truly begins. When you stop living from the gap between what is and what should be, life begins to reorganize itself in ways that feel almost otherworldly. It's not that challenges vanish or that every day becomes an uninterrupted stream of bliss. It's that your relationship to everything changes. You are no longer chasing outcomes like a thirsty traveler stumbling after a mirage. You are standing at the well, already quenched, curious about what water might taste like today. In the old paradigm, manifestation was fueled by tension. Every intention carried a quiet undertone of, I don't have this yet, which, like a faint but persistent echo, kept broadcasting the signal of lack. You might have tried to bury that signal under affirmations, vision boards, and perfectly scripted meditations, but the undertone was always there. Now, in the recognition of your own wholeness, that signal dissolves. Creation stops being an emergency and starts becoming an exploration. And in this exploration, something astonishing happens. The right opportunities seem to drift into your orbit without you reaching for them. Relationships arrive that feel like missing puzzle pieces. Projects fall into place with the kind of timing you couldn't have orchestrated if you tried. These aren't rewards for passing the final test. They are simply the natural reflections of a consciousness no longer tangled in its own resistance. History is filled with quiet examples of this principle at work. Consider the mystics of the Desert Fathers in early Christian history. They didn't seek solitude to force a revelation. They entered solitude because they had already touched something whole within themselves. In that stillness, their lives, even in scarcity, seemed to unfold with a grace that defied logic. Or think of the 13th century poet Rumi, who never claimed to manifest anything, yet lived a life woven with uncanny synchronicities, all because he moved from a state of overflowing love rather than longing. In your own life, this might show up in small, almost unremarkable ways at first. A conversation that opens a door you didn't know existed. A chance encounter that feels impossibly timed. A solution to a long-standing problem, appearing the moment you stop trying to force it. These moments aren't magic in the sense of bending reality to your will. They are magic in the sense of revealing that reality itself has always been alive, responsive, and intertwined with your awareness. From here, the question shifts entirely. You no longer ask, "How can I get what I want?" Instead, you wonder, what might consciousness, in the form of me, want to explore next? It is the difference between steering a ship with white-knuckled control and leaning into the wind with full trust in the ocean's intelligence. This is the essence of living without the gap, the absence of strain, the ease of movement, the delight of unfolding. And it is here, in this space of quiet openness, that the next calling begins to whisper. Not toward more personal achievement, but toward a role far larger than yourself. The role of becoming a steady, living signal in the field for others who are still searching. The role of a field anchor. Crossing the threshold into this new way of being is not the end of the path. It is the opening of an entirely different kind of journey. If the years of seeking were about refining and awakening your own awareness, this next chapter is about embodying that awareness in a way that ripples outward into the collective field. You are no longer just a traveler on the road. You have become a lantern along it. A field anchor is not a title you claim. It's not a role you perform. It is the natural consequence of living in steady coherence with your true nature. Your very presence, the steadiness in your eyes, the ease in your voice, the absence of hidden agendas, becomes a point of reference for others. Without you saying a word, the frequency you hold makes it easier for those around you to relax into their own authenticity. This isn't about teaching or preaching. History shows us that some of the most profound influences on human consciousness came not from the loudest voices, but from those who lived so fully in alignment with themselves that their very existence was an invitation. Think of Mahatma Gandhi sitting in silence for hours before speaking a word, allowing the truth to ripen in stillness, or the early Quakers, whose gatherings often consisted of long, shared quiet until someone felt moved to speak, not from ego, but from the pulse of something deeper. Their influence did not come from convincing others, but from being a living demonstration of what they spoke about. When you embody this state, your life becomes a subtle but constant transmission. In a conversation, your calm may steady someone else's agitation without you consciously trying. In your work, your clarity might inspire a team to align without drama. Even in passing interactions with a cashier, a stranger on the street, something in the way you meet their eyes communicates a truth words can't touch. You are already whole. You are already enough. And the paradox is that you do not do this for others. You live this way because it is who you are now. The ripple effect is simply what happens when coherence enters a field of chaos. Order begins to emerge naturally, but to be a field anchor is also to accept a deeper responsibility, not the heavy, self-sacrificing kind, but the responsibility to stay honest with yourself, to return to presence when you are pulled into old patterns, to embody the truth even when the world around you is tempting you to forget. This is why your journey brought you through so much contrast. The moments of struggle have trained you to stand in your center when everything else is in motion. You did not pass the final test just to rest in your own peace. You passed it so that your peace could become part of the great invisible architecture holding up the world's awakening. In ways you may never see, your stability becomes someone else's turning point. Your authenticity becomes someone else's permission, and your willingness to be becomes a mirror in which others glimpse their own reflection. From here on, the measure of your life is not in how much you achieve, but in how deeply you embody. And in that embodiment, the human side of awakening, the part the old seeker might have tried to avoid, will become not your obstacle, but your greatest teacher. Awakening does not erase your humanity. It reveals it in sharper, more luminous detail. The old fantasy that enlightenment would lift you out of life's messiness dissolves quickly once you realize that being awake means being more present to the full spectrum of experience, not less. Joy and grief, clarity and confusion, tenderness and frustration, all of it still arises. The difference now is that you no longer see these as proof that you failed. You see them as the textures of being alive. This is where embodied resilience takes root. It's not the brittle toughness of pretending nothing can touch you, nor is it the fragile calm that shatters when life veers off script. True resilience is the capacity to remain connected to your essential nature, even in the midst of chaos. It's a skill honed not in perfect conditions, but in the unpredictable, unscripted reality of human life. History gives us luminous examples of this. Think of Viktor Frankl, surviving the brutality of concentration camps, not by denying his pain, but by holding fast to meaning. Consider Harriet Tubman, leading others to freedom under the constant threat of capture, guided by an inner certainty that could not be shaken. Or the 17th century Japanese swordsman and philosopher Miyamoto Musashi, who wrote about maintaining presence, even in the face of 1,000 enemies. These were not people untouched by difficulty. They were people who met difficulty without abandoning themselves. For you, embodied resilience might mean staying grounded when an argument flares, or remaining open-hearted when someone misunderstands you. It might mean showing up to a difficult task without the drama of inner resistance, or sitting quietly with your own fear without rushing to banish it. Every time you meet life from your center instead of your conditioning, you are strengthening this muscle. And here's the truth the seeker rarely hears. Challenges don't end after awakening because they are not here to block your path. They are part of the path. They're the forge in which your embodiment is tempered. Each setback, each emotional wave, each unforeseen twist is another invitation to trust what you already know to be true. That who you are is not fragile, not incomplete, not dependent on circumstances. Over time, this deep trust becomes second nature. You stop recoiling from the discomforts of life and begin to lean into them, curious about what they might reveal. In this way, even so-called problems become allies, shaping you into a steadier, more compassionate presence. And it is this very humanity, held without resistance, that becomes the bridge for others to cross from seeking into being. From here, The next step is not about transcending the human experience, but about fully integrating your awakening into the life you are already living. And that means dismantling the last remnants of the seeker identity. The seeker identity is a subtle thing. Even after profound realizations, it can linger like an old scent in the fabric of your life. The quiet hum of there's still something I need to get, fix, or understand. Integration begins when you notice that hum, and instead of following it, you let it fade into silence. Living from presence is deceptively simple. There are no elaborate rituals, no exhausting mental checklists, no constant scanning for signs of progress. The work is in allowing yourself to stay here now without running toward the next thing. And as you do, you begin to see how many of your old habits were born from the seeker's endless forward lean. Relationships offer some of the clearest mirrors for this change. When you no longer need someone to confirm your worth or fill the gaps you once believed you had, you meet them as they are, without the haze of expectation. Some connections will deepen into a richness you couldn't have scripted. Others may quietly dissolve, not out of conflict, but because the dynamic that held them together no longer exists. History is full of moments where such integration reshaped communities. In 5th century China, after decades of intense meditation practice, the Buddhist master Bodhidharma shifted his teaching to emphasize direct experience over rote discipline. His presence alone was said to communicate more than his words. In 20th century India, Ramana Maharshi lived much the same way, not seeking followers, but allowing those drawn to his quiet to discover themselves in his stillness. Integration, for them, wasn't about acquiring more knowledge. It was about embodying what they already knew. In your daily life, integration may look ordinary on the surface. You prepare a meal, you answer emails, you walk to the store, yet underneath the current has changed. These actions are not vehicles to get you somewhere else. They are expressions of where you already are. You are no longer living in preparation for life to begin. You're living it. And this is the point where the seeker identity dissolves completely. You stop watching yourself to make sure you're doing it right. You stop grading your inner state like an exam. You no longer measure today's peace against yesterday's insights. You understand that awareness is not a project. It is your nature. Once this clicks, the energy that was once tied up in seeking becomes free. Free to move into your work, your art, your relationships, your service. Free to express the unique flavor of consciousness that you are. And this is where your being begins to serve not just you, but the whole. Not as a mission to fulfill, but as a natural consequence of living in alignment with what you are. That's when your life stops being about what you can get from the world and starts becoming about what you naturally give to it, without effort, without strategy, without calculation. This is the quiet power of service through being. True service begins the moment you stop trying to be of service, not because you withdraw from life, but because you understand that the most profound gift you can offer is your unfiltered, unperformed presence. In this space, you are not a rescuer, a teacher, or a fixer. You are a mirror. And in your reflection, others see the wholeness they had forgotten was theirs. This is not a role you play, and it's not driven by obligation. The impulse to help arises naturally, the way a tree offers shade or a candle offers light. You're not trying to make the world better. You're simply living in a way that reveals a better way is already here. Throughout history, the quiet influence of such beings has rippled through generations. In medieval Japan, Ikkyu Sojun, a Zen monk often seen as unorthodox, transformed entire communities, not by adhering to rigid spiritual norms, but by living with an unshakable authenticity that others couldn't help but feel. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement was shaped not only by speeches and marches, but by the steady presence of individuals who embodied courage and compassion in their daily lives, influencing others without a single public word. In your life, service through being might look like sitting with a friend in silence without trying to solve their problem. It might be the way you listen with full attention to someone's story, even when the world around you rushes by. It might be how your calm steadies a tense room, or how your laughter softens the sharp edges of someone else's day. And here's the paradox: the more you live this way, the less you need to be recognized for it. You're no longer measuring your value by the impact you make. You simply trust that whatever ripples out from your authentic presence will find its way where it's needed. But there is a quiet responsibility in this as well. Being a living example means being willing to embody truth, even when it's inconvenient. It means showing patience when fear wants you to rush, compassion when judgment feels easier, honesty when pretending would be safer. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being real, consistently enough that others know your presence is a place they can rest without being measured. The longer you live this way, the more you see that awakening was never a personal victory. It was a preparation, a deep, invisible apprenticeship for participating in the collective evolution of consciousness. And in that participation, your choices matter more than you might think, because each time you choose to embody what you are, instead of slipping back into the old performance, you shift the field for everyone. From here, the journey narrows to something simple yet vast, a choice you make in every moment, a choice that is both the smallest step and the most profound act you will ever take. Awakening is not a single, glittering moment after which life remains effortlessly perfect. It is a continual invitation, one that meets you in the smallest choices of the day. In each encounter, in each thought, in each breath, you stand at a crossroads between remembering and forgetting, between embodying and pretending. The beauty of this choice is that it doesn't demand grandeur. It shows up in the quiet, ordinary moments, pausing before reacting to a sharp word, listening without rehearsing your reply, feeling gratitude without needing a reason. These moments, stitched together, become the fabric of a life lived from your natural state. When you remember that you are not separate from what you experience, life softens. Even challenges cease to feel like enemies. You see them as part of consciousness exploring itself. Not interruptions to your peace, but textures within it. The old reflex to control, to push away discomfort or grasp at pleasure, begins to lose its urgency. You don't need to manipulate the present to feel whole. You are whole, here and now. This perspective changes the way you move through the world. You stop waiting for the right conditions to start living. You stop measuring the day by its successes or failures, and instead by how fully you met it. You stop negotiating with reality, asking it to be different before you can open your heart. The choice in every moment is not between spiritual and mundane, evolved and unevolved, enlightened and asleep. It is between living as what you are or as who you think you should be. And when you choose what you are, even imperfectly, even briefly, the field around you changes. People feel it, the world feels it. This is how transformation spreads, not through mass persuasion or rigid doctrine, but through countless beings quietly choosing to remember. Just as the ocean's tide is shaped by the pull of the moon, the collective field is shaped by those who live in coherence with themselves. The more you rest here, the more natural it becomes. The more natural it becomes, the more your life ceases to be about passing tests and starts to be about simply being the truth you've discovered. You are no longer a seeker chasing the horizon. You are the horizon, endlessly unfolding into new expressions. You are the dream and the dreamer, the question and the answer. You are consciousness itself, living through this exact form in this exact moment for no other reason than the joy of experiencing itself. And so the real adventure begins, not in searching, not in striving, but in choosing moment after moment to live as the magnificent being you have always been. The test is complete. The embodiment begins now,